My name is Linda Hayes. I'm 68 years old, and until recently, I believed my life had been built on steady ground. For 42 years, I was a wife. I woke each morning beside the same man, shared the same table, walked the same familiar halls of the home we built together. Marriage, family, stability, those were the anchors of my life. I thought they would carry me through old age gently, like a ship gliding into safe harbor. But life has a way of shattering what you think is permanent. I learned that truth the day I sat in a quiet office, surrounded by the people I loved, waiting for my husband's last words to be read aloud. The lawyer's voice was calm, almost cold, as if the weight of his words meant nothing. Papers rustled. The air felt thick, and every breath seemed louder than it should have. My daughter, Emily, sat straight-backed, her husband Michael by her side. Their hands brushed together, a silent signal of anticipation. I wanted to believe that moment was one of shared grief, of family clinging together. But beneath their smiles, I sensed something else, a hunger I could not name. When the will was read, it was as though the air had been sucked from the room. My husband's fortune, the house, the family name, everything I thought we had built together, was passed directly to Emily and Michael. Their triumph showed in the glint of their eyes, in the way they leaned closer to one another, already claiming their victory. And then came my name, my portion, my life's inheritance, a cabin, a rundown property hidden in the mountains, left to me as though it were an afterthought. My daughter inherited the legacy of our family. I was handed exile. I sat there, still and silent, the words echoing inside me like stones dropped into a well. My hands didn't move. My lips didn't part. I couldn't show them what was unraveling inside. Because in that moment, the life I thought I knew, the family I thought I had, shifted into something unrecognizable. And it was only the beginning. The lawyer's words hung in the air long after he stopped speaking. His tone was professional, clipped, detached, as if the weight of what he had just delivered had nothing to do with the woman sitting in front of him. For Emily and Brian, however, those words were a crown. I could see it in the way Emily's lips curled into a smile she tried and failed to suppress, the way Brian straightened in his chair as if he had just been knighted. They sat there, hand in hand, their triumph plain for everyone to see. I, on the other hand, sat frozen. My name had been called, yes, but only as an afterthought. A cabin in the mountains, a place I had never loved, never chosen. That was my portion. That was the sum of my 42 years of loyalty. The house we built together, the life we crafted, the security I believed would carry me into old age, all of it had been handed to my daughter and her husband. I wanted to speak, to ask why, to cry out in disbelief, but the words never came. I had been a wife for most of my life, a mother for just as long. I had carried dinners to the table, cleaned floors until my knees ached, smoothed over arguments before they became wars. I had given everything, and yet, in that room, I was invisible. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. My fingers dug into the arms of the chair, but my face remained steady. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. My daughter's gaze drifted toward me, soft and false, as if she were offering me pity. Brian leaned closer to her, and they exchanged a glance, one that stung me more than the lawyer's words. It was the look of two people who had won, and who knew I had lost. The humiliation burned through me. To be diminished so casually, so publicly, by the man I had loved and the child I had raised, it was a betrayal deeper than I could bear to name. I thought of the long nights I had spent waiting for my husband to come home, the sacrifices I made so our daughter could have everything she wanted, the dreams I had let go of because family always came first. All of that now felt like a cruel joke. I sat still, my breath shallow, as though even moving might shatter the thin shell holding me together. No one in that room reached for my hand. No one asked if I was all right. The only sound was the scratch of the lawyer's pen and the shuffle of papers. In that moment, I understood I had been cast aside. My place in the family I built had been taken from me, not by strangers, but by my own blood. And that was only the beginning of the exile I was about to face. When I first carried my bags into Emily's house, I told myself it was temporary, a small adjustment. I thought, families help each other, and perhaps grief had made me too sensitive. I wanted to believe I was still part of something solid, but almost immediately, I felt the ground shift beneath me. My bedroom was no longer mine. Instead of the warm space where I once shared mornings with Richard, I was shown to a room already staged like a guest chamber, neutral colors, no trace of history. My belongings fit awkwardly into drawers that weren't meant for me. The walls carried none of my past, only silence. At dinner, I used to sit at the head of the table, serving meals, guiding conversation, holding our family together. Now I found myself sliding into a corner chair while Emily placed herself at the center. She decorated the table with careful arrangements, her voice rising brightly as she spoke over everyone else. Brian's laugh filled the room, booming and self-assured. My words, when I tried to add them, seemed to vanish into the air, unnoticed. I became useful only in ways that made me invisible. I cooked. I washed dishes. I folded laundry that was not mine. I moved quietly through the house, slipping into hallways when their friends arrived, so as not to embarrass them. The very home that had once been shaped by my hands had become a stage where I had no role. What hurt most were the small things. Emily's hand on Brian's arm, a little too triumphant. The way she called me mom in front of guests with a polished sweetness, masking the fact that my presence was an inconvenience. Her gestures of kindness carried edges and invitation to stay, but not to belong. Sometimes, I closed my eyes and remembered the years when this family revolved around me. The birthdays I planned, the scraped knees I bandaged, the endless sacrifices I made so Emily could grow into the woman she became. But in that house, I was no longer a mother. I was a shadow trailing behind her life. Day by day, I felt myself shrinking, erased by the very people I once lived for. And deep inside, I began to sense it. They didn't want me there. Something was coming, something colder than silence. It began like any other morning. I rose quietly, folded the blanket on the bed that was never truly mine, and made my way to the kitchen. The house carried its usual rhythm, the hum of the refrigerator, faint footsteps upstairs, the distant sound of a shower running. I tried to ground myself in these ordinary details, as if they could convince me that I belonged here, that I was safe. But when I returned to my room, everything changed. My suitcases were lined neatly against the wall, zipped and waiting. The sight stopped me cold. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, that perhaps someone had mistaken my things for storage. But no, the luggage was mine. every piece carefully packed as though I were already gone. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They had planned this. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. My daughter's hands had folded my clothes, tucked away the small remnants of my life, and placed them by the door, as if I were a burden being removed. The home that once pulsed with my presence now expelled me like an unwelcome guest. I searched the silence for some trace of compassion, some sign that I was still loved. Instead, what I felt was distance, an invisible wall between me and the life I had built. Emily and Brian no longer needed to say anything. Their message was clear. My time here was over. The humiliation burned deeper than words. To be discarded not by strangers, but by my own child, there are no terms for that kind of cruelty. My years of sacrifice, the decades of love, all reduced to a pair of suitcases by the door. Fear crept in as I thought of where I would go. Then I remembered the cabin in Colorado, the lonely inheritance I had once dismissed as worthless. It was as though the choice had been made for me. Exile, disguised as practicality. With trembling hands, I lifted one of the bags. My body moved, but my heart stayed behind, shattered in that room. I walked out quietly, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of seeing my pain. That was the morning I ceased to be a mother in her daughter's home, and that was the day I began a journey into exile, toward a cabin that would change everything. The drive into Colorado felt endless. Mile after mile of winding roads stretched out before me, the mountains rising like silent witnesses to my exile. The farther I went, the thinner the world seemed to become. Towns disappeared, gas stations vanished. Even the hum of radio stations gave way to static, until all I could hear was the drone of the tires and the hollow echo of my own thoughts. The sky darkened early, heavy with gray clouds, and the pine trees pressed in close, their shadows long and unwelcoming. By the time I turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin, I was swallowed by silence. The air felt different here, colder, sharper. It carried the weight of isolation. And then I saw it, the cabin that was supposed to be my inheritance, my consolation prize. From the outside, it looked abandoned, leaning into itself as if tired of standing. Shingles curled up from the roof. The porch sagged under years of neglect, and the windows were clouded with dust. My heart sank. This was what my life had been reduced to, a broken house at the edge of nowhere. Still, I forced myself to step forward. The key trembled in my hand as I turned it in the lock, expecting the hollow creak of emptiness. But the moment the door opened, the air shifted. Warmth hit me first, not stale, not musty, but lived in warmth. The smell of wood smoke lingered faintly, and I froze, trying to make sense of it. Inside, the cabin was nothing like its shell. A rug lay neatly across the floor. The fireplace had been swept and ready. Dishes were stacked in the sink as if waiting to be washed. On the table sat a half-empty glass, a faint ring of condensation beneath it. My pulse quickened. Someone had been here? I walked slowly, afraid to disturb the stillness. A plate with crumbs sat nearby, as though breakfast had been abandoned in haste. On the couch, a folded blanket carried the faint warmth of a body that had rested there not long ago. Then, in the corner of the desk, I noticed a notebook left open, its pages filled with handwriting I couldn't bring myself to read yet. The sight of it made the room feel both intimate and threatening, as if I had just stepped into someone else's life uninvited. The cabin wasn't empty. It was waiting. For me, for someone else I didn't know. But as I stood there, the sorrow I had carried began to shift into something sharper, a mixture of dread and curiosity. This place held secrets, and I had the sinking feeling that the answers I found here would unravel everything I thought I knew. I didn't know it then, but the truth waiting inside those walls was far more shocking than I could have imagined. The cabin had already unsettled me with its strange warmth, but the longer I stayed, the more I noticed little things that didn't add up. A draft slipping through a wall that shouldn't have had gaps. A faint thud beneath the floorboards, as if the house itself had a heartbeat. One night, while running my hand along a bookcase, I felt it shift. My chest tightened. I pushed harder, and with a groan, the entire case slid open, revealing a narrow passage swallowed in darkness. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, before finally stepping inside. The air was cooler, tinged with the scent of dust and paper. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its pull chain swaying gently as though someone had been there not long ago. When I tugged it, light spilled across the room, and my world tilted on its axis. Maps covered the walls, pinned with markers and notes in handwriting I knew by heart. Stacks of folders lined a desk, spilling over with photographs, bank records, and receipts tied together with string. And there, on the center of the desk, lay a sealed envelope with my name written across it. Linda. My knees almost gave way. My hands shook as I tore it open. The first line stole the air from my lungs. If you are reading this, it means I am still alive. It was Richard, my husband, the man I had buried in my heart with grief. The letter explained everything, how he had uncovered corruption, running deep into business deals tied to Brian. How powerful men stood to lose millions if the truth came out. How he became a target. He couldn't protect me if he stayed. His death, he said, had to be staged. The funeral I had cried through was nothing but theater. He wrote that the cabin was not a punishment, but a refuge. Inside its walls lay the evidence needed to expose the men who had betrayed us. He gave me two choices: take the evidence and fight, or disappear with a new identity he had arranged. Either path meant leaving behind the life I once knew. My hands clutched the letter so tightly it nearly tore. Relief washed over me in waves. Richard was alive. But then the grief came crashing back, fiercer than before. He had left me to mourn him, to endure betrayal and exile alone. I felt anger coil inside me, sharp and hot, but beneath it stirred something else. Strength, because now I knew the truth. My daughter and her husband were not just selfish, they were complicit. And the choice Richard had given me was no choice at all. I could not disappear. Not now. I folded the letter, pressing it to my chest. My life had just been rewritten, and the danger surrounding me was far greater than I ever imagined. And yet, for the first time, I felt ready to face it. The night was too still. I sat with Richard's letter clutched in my lap when I first heard it, the low growl of engines climbing the dirt road. Headlights cut through the trees, piercing the darkness. My stomach dropped. SUVs, black and heavy, rolled up to the cabin like predators circling prey. Whoever they weren't here to help me. Panic tightened my chest. Richard's words rushed back warnings I hadn't yet understood. Now they made sense. They were coming for me. For the evidence. The house seemed to close in. Every creak of the floorboards too loud. Every shadow too thin. I remembered the passage behind the bookcase. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I slid it open and ducked inside, pulling it shut just as the sound of boots thundered on the porch. A crash followed the front door splintering. Voices barked orders, muffled but sharp. The tunnel was narrow, its air damp and cold. My palms scraped along rough stone as I stumbled forward, heart hammering. Above me, footsteps pounded. They were tearing the cabin apart. I kept moving, forcing myself not to look back, whispering silently to Richard as though he could hear me. Please, let this way out be real. At last, the tunnel spat me out onto a slope behind the cabin. The forest spread before me, black and endless. For a second, I thought I was alone. Then a truck's headlights flickered in the distance. The driver leaned out a woman, her face weathered but sharp, eyes urgent. She waved me forward. Get in. Her expression seemed to say. I didn't question it. My feet flew. I yanked the door open and barely slammed it shut before the tires screeched, gravel spraying as we tore down the mountain road. Behind us, beams of light cut through the trees. The SUVs were in pursuit. The truck rattled violently as the woman, who I later learned was named Nora, gripped the wheel with steady hands. Bullets cracked through the night, snapping branches around us. I ducked low, clutching the seat as the chase closed in. Every corner felt like the last, every skid a breath from disaster. Yet Nora drove with the calm of someone who had done this before. When we finally hit a wider road, she gunned the engine, leaving the headlights of the SUVs fading into the distance. My body shook, my breath ragged. But for the first time since opening Richard's letter, I wasn't alone. Still, the relief was fragile. If they could find the cabin, they could find me anywhere. Richard's secrets were bigger than I realized, and now I was caught in the center of them. I had escaped for tonight, but the fight was only beginning. Dawn came with the sound of helicopters. I stood with Nora at the edge of the property when black vans and armored vehicles swarmed my daughter's home. The front door splintered, and agents poured in with weapons drawn. Emily's scream cut through the morning air, followed by Brian's curses. I watched, numb, as my own child was pulled from the house in handcuffs, her face twisted in rage and fear. Brian fought harder, shouting until the agents forced him down. But Emily only locked eyes with me once, and what I saw there was not remorse, only betrayal etched deep. The arrests were quick, almost cold in their precision, but the weight of them pressed into me long after the vehicles disappeared. Weeks later, I found myself in a courtroom, the wood-paneled walls heavy with history and judgment. Brian sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched, while Emily kept her eyes lowered, avoiding me entirely. The charges were long fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, attempted harm. Each word felt like a stone dropped into the silence. When I was called to testify, my legs felt weak, but I forced myself forward. I spoke of the will, of the exile, of the documents Richard had left behind. The defense tried to cut me down, suggesting confusion, grief, even senility, but the truth carried its own weight, steady and undeniable. Every time I faltered, I thought of Richard's letter, of the life they had stolen from me, and I steadied my voice. The cross-examination was brutal. I was asked to admit my daughter was family, to acknowledge the blood tie that bound us. I did. And then I said aloud the truth I had buried for too long, that family can wound deeper than any enemy. When the verdict came, the room was silent. Guilty? Both of them. Brian slumped, his mask cracking. Emily's face stayed unreadable, but I saw her shoulders shake. For a moment, I wanted to reach for her, the way I once had when she was a little girl. But my hands stayed folded in my lap. Justice had come. Yet it did not feel like victory. It felt like survival, like a storm finally breaking, leaving wreckage in its wake. And as I walked out of that courtroom, I knew I had to decide what to build in the silence that followed. When the trial ended and the noise of lawyers, reporters, and endless questions faded, I found myself back at the cabin, the place where everything had broken apart, and somehow, the place where I would begin again. It didn't look the same. What had once been sagging wood and peeling paint now stood straighter, brighter. Fresh shingles covered the roof. The porch no longer groaned under my weight, and flowers bloomed along the path. It wasn't grand, but it was alive, and so was I. Inside, I carved out new routines. I woke with the sunrise, the light spilling through the windows, and brewed coffee at my own pace. I picked up a brush and began to paint again, something I hadn't done since college. At first, it was just landscapes, the mountains that surrounded me, the lake that glimmered in the afternoon sun. But slowly, I painted pieces of myself, the grief, the betrayal, and finally, the resilience that had carried me here. Each canvas felt like a conversation I had long denied myself. The silence no longer felt like punishment. It became space. Space to think, to breathe, to remember who I was when I wasn't someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's burden. For the first time in decades, I belonged wholly to myself. Looking back, the lessons came sharp but clear. Trusting instincts matters, even when the truth hurts. Keeping records, paying attention to details, those small acts can mean survival. And perhaps the hardest truth of all, independence is not reserved for the young. At 68, I discovered that freedom is timeless, and self-worth doesn't retire. I often think of Richard, whether he is still out there or lost to the shadows he chose. I don't know. What I do know is that his secrets forced me to face mine, that I had lived too long in silence. Justice came, not as a victory, but as a clearing of the air. Now I breathe more deeply because of it. Truth, I've learned, is like oxygen. You cannot live without it, and survival, at any age, is not just possible, it is a second chance. If my story has stirred something in you, if it made you think of your own strength or your own choices, I hope you'll share it. Leave a comment. Let me know what it brought up for you. And if you believe others might need to hear it, please like and share. Because sometimes, the right story arrives exactly when we need it.